So there's a handout going around. It's a handout of the slides that I'll be presenting, and there's also a 2-page reference list to different works that I'll refer to, but I'd suggest that you try to follow the screen presentation instead, because since making the handout, I've deleted a few slides in the interest of time. So, first of all, I'd like to thank Language Learning for including me in this roundtable. And I'd like to especially thank Gabriele for organizing this roundtable. I think he's done a very good job. So, I'm going to change perspectives a little bit now and talk more about classroom-based research. As Paul said, we were asked to send other members of the panel a few papers that we feel are exemplary of our work. And so I'm going to talk not necessarily about current work. I'm going to start with a study that I did in 2004 and a more recent joint paper, Lyster and Izquierdo from 2009, and a recent meta-analysis from 2010. My talk is about corrective feedback, and in the title, though, I'll just go back to the title, I've called it Variable Effects of Interactional Feedback as Instructional Input. And I, like others, sometimes oscillate between the term corrective feedback and instructional feedback, although I will, throughout the talk, use the term corrective feedback, but I just want to point out that the reason we often call it interactional feedback is simply that often it's not corrective in purpose. And that's one of the problems with feedback, is that teachers use it for a multiplicity of functions, and they're not all corrective in nature. And I also just want to refer to definitions of corrective feedback. It can be defined very simply, as Rod Ellis has done, responses to learner utterances containing an error, but also Chaudron years ago defined it as a complex phenomenon with several functions. And indeed, it does have several functions. And in my work on corrective feedback, I'm coming more and more to realize that it's actually quite central to language pedagogy. I think when I started looking at feedback, I thought that maybe it was a bit peripheral, maybe a little bit like the icing on the cake, but I actually think it's really fundamental to classroom interaction, and especially in terms of the kind of scaffolding opportunities it gives to teachers as they interact with students. And so the way I look at feedback is a bit more in terms of scaffolding. So I want to go back to a paper that was published in 1997 that I wrote with Leila Ranta, where we defined 6 different feedback types in a set of immersion classrooms in Montreal, French immersion classrooms. So basically we observed recast, which you are probably very familiar with, a very implicit way of reformulating what the student has said. We also observed what we called explicit correction, that is when the teacher also reformulates the response but makes it very clear to the learner that what he or she had said was erroneous. And then we identified 4 different feedback types that we called the negotiation of form, sort of in contrast to the negotiation of meaning. And I've since started calling these prompts, and these are simply feedback moves when the teacher withholds the correct form and instead pushes the learner to try to retrieve the correct form on his or her own. So these are basically what I see as 3 types of feedback, for better or worse, and I'll come to this later. I've sort of lumped several feedback types under prompts. They're different. Some are more implicit, some are more explicit, but they all have in common this idea of not giving the form to the students and functioning as a way of pushing students to self-repair. So in our study, what was quite striking to us was the prevalence of recasting. What you see here in green is the percentage across 4 different teachers, and it represents the percentage of total corrective feedback used by the teachers, and you'll see that over 55% of all of the feedback included recasting. And this has since been documented in many classrooms around the world in different types of instructional settings. It's quite clear that recasting, for many reasons, is teachers' preferred way, at least in, let's say, sort of naturalistic classroom settings. It's a preferred way of providing feedback. So what I want to point out, our article actually caused a little bit of controversy because at the same time, Long had published his updated interaction hypothesis in 1996 in which he really advocated the use of recasting as being a really important part of negotiation for meaning and very helpful therefore for language development. But our paper came out and actually all we said, this is the conclusion, I went back and looked up the conclusion, all we said was that teachers might want to consider the whole range of techniques they have at their disposal rather than relying so extensively on recasts. So in other words, diversify their corrective feedback types and not use only recasts. And yet at the same time, theoretically, we were getting lots of accounts that really recasting is what should be happening for the purposes of second language acquisition. And what followed was a series of lab studies that were designed really to test the effectiveness of recasting. And it was quite clear from the lab studies that recasting was quite effective. But when you look closely at some of these studies, recasting was effective not necessarily in relationship to other types of feedback. One study didn't have a control group. Sometimes the control groups weren't given any feedback, so there was no comparison across feedback types. In one study, the recasts were compared to models, which aren't a form of feedback because they're provided before a learner speaks and not after. And some of the studies compared recasting with what was called negotiation or negotiated interaction, which was a mixture of different types of feedback. And sometimes this negotiation actually included recasts serving as confirmation checks. Now, at the same time, there was one classroom study that came out that showed that recasting was effective in classrooms, but this was the Dowdy and Varela study from 1998, which is a very interesting study because it's a classroom study and it's done in the context of content-based ESL in science lessons. So there are really interesting science activities that were designed, and it was during these science activities that the students were given corrective feedback. So the design is very interesting. However, and what was shown was that the group that was getting the corrective feedback outperformed the group that did not receive feedback. But what's very unusual about this study is that it was framed as a study on recasting. And recasts were called implicit negative evidence. It was actually called corrective recasting. And corrective recasting was claimed to be implicit negative evidence. But this is the feedback move that learners were given, actually. So the study doesn't really tell us anything about recasting. The first move that the teacher used was a repetition of the learner's error. And if the learner did not self-repair after hearing the repetition of the error, then the teacher recast. And both in the repetition move and in the recasting move, there was emphasis highlighted there was emphasis added to highlight the incorrect form and then the correct form. So it wasn't a very good argument for implicit negative feedback, and it also didn't correspond to the types of recasts that we were observing in content-based classrooms in the research I had previously done. So between this study and the lab studies, I was compelled to do a classroom study in which recasts were compared to other types of feedback, which I called prompts. So this is the paper from 2004. And it was done with 10-year-old children in grade 5 in the Montreal area. These are French immersion students. And I had 4 groups. I had a teacher who agreed to do it. So I have to say, first of all, that the students received some form-focused instruction about grammatical gender in French. One teacher during the form-focused instruction only recast. Another one only provided prompts. I also had a control group where the teacher agreed to and was very happy not to give any feedback. And I also had a comparison group. And it had a typical quasi-experimental design with pre-tests, treatment, and 2 post-tests. I just want to show you this one slide. This is because sometimes when people who do quantitative research and they reduced their design to a pre-test, post-test design. Sometimes we get criticized for doing something really quick and dirty. But I just want to show you that this study from inception to publication took 5 years because it involved making strong connections with the schools and meeting the teachers and getting to know the teachers and observing the teachers and designing the instructional materials, which really, really took a lot of time and a lot of consulting with the teachers and so on. And the actual study actually took place during 1 year. And then the data analysis was particularly difficult because we were focusing on grammatical gender. And one of the problems with grammatical gender, at least the way the learners in my context learn it, is that they've learned a strategy because it's so hard for Anglophone learners to mark nouns correctly in terms of gender. These immersion students have created a hybrid determiner. So instead of saying something like le or la, they say something like le. And instead of saying un or une, it's kind of une. So it took literally about a year to transcribe the data. And also, one of the problems with this study has to do with that particular focus, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So, one thing I want to stress about corrective feedback, in my view, is that it's only relevant if provided in the context of some sort of instruction. In other words, feedback that's just provided randomly and incidentally, as Long and others claim language teaching should be, I really disagree with that. I think that the best language teaching is well-planned teaching, and well-planned teaching includes really sort of a strategically planned feedback. So this is the form focus instruction in this study was drawing students' attention to noun endings in French to show that many noun endings in French can predict grammatical gender. And this is not information they normally get because it doesn't appear in French grammar books, okay? French grammar books say that grammatical gender is arbitrary. Because I'm not talking about gender agreement. I'm not talking about agreement between a noun and an adjective. I'm talking about gender attribution, which is why a noun is masculine or feminine in the first place, and a lot of it has to do with noun endings, with a large set of nouns in French. So this was the nature of the instruction. There were also lots of practice activities. We had lots of riddles and things like that, also related to the students' curriculum, so that they were being pushed to use certain target nouns and thereby providing teachers with opportunities to provide them with feedback on grammatical gender attribution. So we found more benefits for the prompt group than the recast group, as we had predicted. The prompt group out-controlled the comparison group on all post-test measures, 8 out of 8. The recast group outperformed the comparison group on 5 out of 8 measures, and the instruction only without feedback group outperformed the comparison group on 4 of the 8 measures. But most of the significant differences were in the writing tasks, the pencil and paper, paper and pencil tasks, or the writing tasks, and not in the oral production. So this is what I was very surprised, because the differences were so great in the writing tasks, and I thought, how could this be? How could they not have improved? The prompt group also improved orally. And this is why the analysis took so long. We finally realized that there was a huge task effect in this study, because to do the oral production tasks, we extracted subsamples of students from the class who interacted one-on-one with a researcher. And so they were getting lots of one-on-one interaction. And while she was interacting with them, because, as I said to you, these learners don't pronounce the determiners very clearly, they're saying un instead of un or une, she had been prompted or trained to make sure they clearly said one or the other. So in essence, she was giving them feedback during this, you see? So this is an example of a design problem where the testing interfered with the treatment, because they were actually receiving the treatment during the testing measures. And so it didn't, so that the different groups weren't distinguished in oral production. What it does mean is that giving feedback to students during oral activities is very helpful because they did very well. And the comparison group also got the same feedback, but they didn't improve at all because they hadn't received any of the form-focused instruction. So, because of this problem, where we didn't get results in terms of oral production, later on we decided to design a study, to implement a study that was a combination of a classroom and a lab study, so that the learners are completely different in this study. Lyster and Izquierdo, 2009. They're university students studying French as a second language. We chose the same target, grammatical gender, and the same type of input enhancement activities. And the teachers implemented these activities, but we withdrew the students from class to give them the interaction, the oral feedback treatment, so that we could really control the feedback, so that we knew exactly how many prompts, each learner received and how many recasts each learner received in another group. So these are the participants, undergraduate students studying French. So the design is similar with a pre-test, post-test, and delayed post-test, except this time the instructional treatment happens the form-focused instructional treatment happens in class, but the feedback treatments happen outside of class, one-on-one with a researcher. So this is a sample of the activities. We designed activities about Quebec film, and again, it was just a question of input enhancement, so that we're just highlighting noun endings and determiners and asking students to do rules discovery tasks, so they're discovering the rules about which endings predict which type of gender, okay? That's the in-class instruction. I mean, I'm going through this part very quickly. And then for the feedback treatments, as I said, it was one-on-one. We designed different tasks that again included a set of riddles. We used picture description and object identification. And what we did in this study, so prompts were basically clarification requests. And if the clarification request didn't elicit self-repair, then the researcher used repetition of error. And normally that wasn't the case. Normally, the clarification requests were sufficient to elicit self-repair. And what we did in this study was that we controlled the output so that learners in the recast condition were not allowed basically to produce, to repeat the recast, whereas in the prompt group, of course, they were encouraged to self-repair. So we were able to compare learners who had opportunities for output with those who had no opportunity for output. So this is another big disappointment to me. We didn't find any differences between the groups. We had predicted that the prompt group, like as in the classroom studies, that the prompt group would outperform the recast group. And on all measures, the recast and prompt group were identical. They made progress over time, significant progress. They benefited from the instruction and feedback, but no differences according to feedback type. So, this was a bit of a surprise at first, especially because we controlled the output variable. So the question was, how can learners who have constant opportunities to produce modified output not do better than the students who have no opportunities to practice to produce modified output? And so I've concurred with many other studies that were done in lab settings that have shown that really the benefits or effectiveness of recasts are unrelated to the immediate uptake. It's unrelated. Mackey and Philp found this in a study back in 1998, that the benefits of recasting are unrelated to immediate production. Whereas prompts, and this is what we found in this study and others have found it too, the benefits of prompts are linked to the opportunities for self-repair that they generate. So what we found is that given the context of laboratory interaction, where a learner is interacting intensively with a researcher, they benefit whether they receive recasts or prompts on the condition that they're getting opportunities to self-repair after prompts, but not necessarily self-repairing after recasts. And so in theoretical terms, what this meant to us is that learners, in terms of recasts, they benefit from the repeated exposure to positive exemplars and also from the opportunities to infer negative evidence. And those in the prompt group are benefiting from the exposure to negative evidence and the opportunities to produce modified output. In other words, the groups performed similarly, but not for the same reasons, because the processing was different. So they're benefiting for different reasons. If we compare this lab study with the classroom study, these studies weren't designed to be comparable. There are a lot of differences. One thing that is the same is the grammatical gender, target, and the same types of form-focused activities, but the results are very different. Okay, in the older learners benefit from both types of feedback in a lab setting. The younger learners benefited more from prompting. So on the one hand, this study says to me that there are huge differences between lab and classroom studies that need to be acknowledged, and it may be the case that studies done in laboratories really don't tell us that much about classroom interaction. And this has been confirmed by review articles and also 2 recent meta-analyses that tend to show that the effects for interaction or feedback are usually greater in laboratory dyadic interaction than in classroom settings. So given the fact that a lot of the meta-analyses that have been coming out often conflate classroom and laboratory studies, I undertook with a PhD student of mine, Kazuya Saito, a meta-analysis of corrective feedback only in classroom studies. And we were able to identify 15 classroom studies that compared different types of feedback. And what I'd like to quickly present here is what we found in terms of different types of feedback, the comparisons we did across the 15 studies. And I also want to mention the age variable, because age came up in the comparison of these other 2 studies where older learners benefited from feedback in one way and younger learners benefited from feedback in another way. So I found it very interesting. So first of all, we were very happy to note that feedback was found across these studies to be more effective than no feedback. So that's always a good thing to find. And questions, arguments put forth by John Trescott and others. But in terms of different types of feedback, we found that basically what we did was we compared recasts, prompts, and explicit correction, drawing on the Lyster and Ranta taxonomy. And we found that all types of feedback basically had significant effects in these classroom studies. But we did find that prompts had larger effects, whereas recasts had medium effects, and explicit correction, depending whether it was a between group or within group analysis, had large to medium effects. In the within-group analysis, there was a significant difference between prompts and recasts, showing prompts to be significantly more effective than recasting. But we didn't really find any differences between prompts, recasts, and explicit correction. So again, this is a similar conclusion to the one that we made in Lyster and Izquierdo, is that learners do benefit from recasts. They can benefit, I think they're benefiting from the positive evidence available, and also for the opportunity to infer negative evidence. The negative evidence isn't necessarily there. They have to infer it. But they benefit even more from prompting, again, because of the negative evidence that is there, and the greater demand that's placed on them for producing modified output. And then we did an analysis of age, and a very interesting finding was that younger learners overall performed or benefited more significantly from feedback than older learners. And this doesn't mean that older learners did not benefit from feedback. They did significantly, but younger learners benefited even more significantly. And so this goes back to some work that has been done by Rhonda Oliver and Alison Mackey, who did some early work looking at age and the difference between interaction in classrooms with adults and those of children. And they concluded that children do seem to be fairly susceptible to corrective feedback. Excuse me. And it may be the case that corrective feedback engages implicit learning mechanisms to which learners still have access. Okay, there's a little bit more work to be done in this area. I find it very interesting looking at age. And in fact, one of our findings was that, this is kind of speculative because this was really done on based on small samples. But based on small samples, we found that for older learners, they benefited similarly from prompts and recasts, whereas younger learners benefited more from prompts. So it may be the case that whereas children are very sensitive to corrective feedback, they may be even more sensitive to pedagogically enhanced feedback delivered through prompts. Okay, so basically what I would like to say is that the way Long has framed in the interaction hypothesis, this idea of implicit negative feedback and the importance of implicit negative feedback in interaction is not supported by classroom research. And I think it's time to move on from the notion of focus on form. He operationalizes focus on form, including feedback, as being incidental and implicit and so on. And I don't think that I think there's some evidence from lab studies, but there's no clear evidence from classroom studies that focus on form should be unplanned, incidental, and implicit. As far as recasting goes, I don't know why anyone would spend a lot of time prescribing recasts for teachers anyway, because teachers already use them all the time. So I don't know why we would say use recasts. I mean, the point is they are. My approach in teacher training is more about become aware of a variety of feedback types and don't over-focus on one type. I just want to point out, I guess because I'm a non-believer, he actually called people who did not support recasts in that way, he called them skeptics, whose doubt is a challenge to the optimism about recasts. And yet the empirical research is really not supporting their exclusive use in classrooms. So you know that the theoretical perspective on recasts is that they can be very useful because they preserve the learner's original meaning, and that frees up resources for the learner to focus on form. But there are many of us that say that that can only happen in a form-oriented context, where the form orientation of the classroom is already priming them to focus on language and allows them to perceive the recast. And that this doesn't take place in more meaning-based classrooms or content-based classrooms, such as those that I work in, where learners, when they're focused on meaning, continue to focus on meaning as they expect the teacher's response to be about the veracity of their message and not about the form of their message. Recasts, I had a video, and I don't have time to show it, of classroom interaction, but what we know about classroom interaction is that recasts serve all sorts of functions, right? Teachers are always repeating what students are saying, whether it's a non-corrective repetition or a recast. We know that teachers do a lot of rebroadcasting. If a student says something, they rebroadcast it so someone can hear it at the back of the classroom. And as I said in my work, and others working in content-based classrooms, such as Pauline Gibbons, talk a lot about scaffolding and the kind of scaffolding support that recasts give to teachers, recasts allow teachers to give scaffolding support to students during interaction. Okay, so I think I got ahead of myself. I didn't. Okay, so this is where I wanted to say that it's time to move away from this idea of, in terms of pedagogy anyway, I'm interested in classrooms, so it's important to move away, I think, from focus on form, because first of all, focus on form doesn't mean very much in most parts of the world, because in most parts of the world, foreign language teaching tends to be very focused on form, right? So in those contexts, you don't necessarily want to integrate more focus on form. So focus on form only means something in a meaning-oriented context where you have communicative language teaching going on. But what we know from a lot of those contexts is that incidental asides and this idea of negotiation for meaning as opposed to form hasn't really been proven empirically through classroom studies, and that most research in classrooms has shown that more explicit approaches and more overt approaches to feedback are more effective. And so what I wanted to conclude by saying we need to move towards new conceptualizations of pedagogy that fit with broader learning objectives and educational objectives. And to do this, in 1 minute, I'm going to give you just sort of you have a handout, so that's going to save me a lot of breath here, because you have the references too, but I just want to point out acknowledge other theoretical perspectives that really, in terms of feedback, very specifically provide support for moving away from implicit kind of recasting and towards a bit more overt attention drawn to language. And so I start with sociocultural theory. If you look at the lower quote here, I mean, this study has been around since 1994, where this whole idea is, the idea of feedback is moving, the idea is for the novice to move away from reliance on the expert. And the idea is moving away from other repair, which is like a recast, towards self-repair, which is really the result of a prompt. And there's an interesting quote there by Lantoff in a very recent paper, too, about the need for explicit interventions in school. That's what school is all about, he says. Skill acquisition theory, prompts serve as a type of practice. Of course, the output hypothesis goes back to Swain's work and also DeBoat and what they say about the importance of retrieval processes and production, enhancing connections in memory. Because Paul is a panelist here, I want to refer to his work, which I've always liked, his paper from 1997, which is called something about the missing no, right? And so, and he says that if it's, you know how in communicative language teaching we always say that it's okay for students to make errors, right? Well, if it's okay to make errors, then it should be okay to correct them explicitly, right? And that for interaction to work, he says that more direct feedback types would allow pedagogy and interaction to work more in tandem. Okay, so, and of course, with a colleague of mine, Hiro Mori, we compared Japanese immersion students with French immersion students and came up with this idea of a counterbalance hypothesis, which says that a better approach than just form-focused instruction is counterbalanced instruction. So that if you're in a context that's really form-oriented, you need to inject more focus on meaning. If you're in a context that's very meaning-oriented, like immersion, you need to inject more of a form orientation. And in this light, we suggested that form-oriented learners would probably benefit quite well from prompts because they can notice them, and also it allows them to stay focused on meaning, which is important. But learners that are very meaning-oriented are going to benefit more by being prompted, okay, and more from form-focused activities to draw their attention to language. And I think that's it. Well, it's not, okay, this is my last slide. I refer to the work of Patsy Lightbound here, who referred to the work of Fanslow in teacher education, who tells teachers to try the opposite. I love this idea, because teachers, he says, teachers tend to keep, you know, they find something comfortable and they do something over and over again. But if you really want students to notice something, then you have to do something unpredictable and kind of do the opposite. Try something different so that you're not always doing the same pattern. So that's why for teachers who are always recasting and feel comfortable with that, I say try something different. And by the same token, if somebody's always explicitly correcting, I guess I could say step back and try some recasting so that students are just able to focus on meaning. And so with that, I want to conclude, but I just want to point out that the last issue of Studies in Second Language Acquisition was co-edited by me and Yoonghee Shin on corrective feedback in both writing and oral production. And that's my book on counterbalanced instruction. Thank you. Want me to open it? Oh, okay.
Our next speaker is going to be Alison McKay from Georgetown University. Thank you.